You know that business about the responsibility of the person who gets murdered for getting murdered? There is a curious sense in which a lot of people go around looking for trouble. I've always noticed that real sages never gossip, never criticize persons. And because they understand so well. The French saying, tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner, to understand all is to forgive all, is so true if you are experienced in just the ordinary way of dealing with human problems.
That said, many people were very critical of Watts, and I think there are different reasons for people being critical of him, everything from his sort of abusive character in, sort of his alcoholism and other things. But I think it was more, for me, the question of the historical reality of the individual and the degree to which some kind of natural guilt has been encumbered in individuals historically. Now, I don't mean a finger shake like you've done something wrong, and I certainly don't want to say that, oh, there's some kind of wrongdoing that people need to seek forgiveness from. When I have said that life is a gift beyond all repayment, here's part of my argument. This is what I've been trying to suggest to people. When I say that life is a gift beyond all repayment and that encumbers a guilt character, part of the argument is that human beings have invented the gods because they needed some kind of person, some kind of being to receive their gifts of exchange, of return, of expiating this sense of awe and mystery that overwhelmed them. I think there is, if we look at studies, we can find a long history of sacrifice, and that sacrifice is attributed to these gods for whom human actions matter and concern and all this sort of stuff. Now, I think when Alan Watts, which I want to agree with in a lot of ways, when he wants to say, well, look, the point is to remove desire, don't cling, become a river, realize that you are a place and moment of the cosmos, that you are, you're something it's doing. There's nothing left to do but, sit back and have a laugh and enjoy the ride, and don't try to get anywhere because you're already more than you could ever be by your intentions or purposes. And there's something that's all very right-minded about that. But there's also something that is covering over a kind of truth about the historical fact of Western culture. And see, part of this is the problem of, can Westerners really be Eastern? See, I think this is part of the problem. That, it's one thing to live a life of monistic practices, to shave one's head and to beg for food and to live with very, very little comforts, and to see that as one's life. That is a way of expiating the guilt of being human. I mean, many of the very austere Buddhist practices were a way to sort of head off guilt at the past by living an absolutely modest life. That's so different than modern Western culture. The kind of BM driving executive who has all kinds of conveniences and a second home somewhere, but then they practice Zen on the weekend. I think it gives a lot of people reason to be skeptical. There are certain kinds of social historical practices that have emerged in Western culture that I don't think anyone can be free from being implicated in. Right? I mean, we're sort of caught with it. Again, it's not a finger shake. Instead, it's to try to tell the story of what happened in Western culture. I mean, I think this is sort of something that happened. And you want to see that in the ancient world, the growing awareness of the disparity between the haves and the have-nots was heavy on people. It was so heavy that they dreamed and longed for an impending end of the world, someone who would, show up and make amends for all the injustice. I mean, the Christ myth, the Christ story, and this comes from the work of people like Eric Kahler, it's Ernest Becker, so much of the work that I've tried to do, it's about, and this is Kierkegaard, it's about the way the historical life journey of the individual was to take a spiritual significance. Right? There's a kind of growth in history of the individual and the releasement of the individual into something like a personal relationship with the cosmos, with the divine. I think it gets talked about as the drift from sort of animistic culture to a polytheistic cultures to, I guess, a kind of monotheistic culture of a people, to then the Jesus myth introduces a radical change. It's this personal relationship that's not bound to any particular culture. Now, for me, this is part of the psychology of human Western history, and it has to do with the impact of changing communication practices, largely the onset of literacy and the drift from shame cultures to guilt cultures. Right? There's lots and lots of work on shame cultures are oral tribal societies where the do's and don'ts come from outward imposition upon another, whereas guilt, it starts to become possible as the individual gets freed up from tribal and collectivist life. I think part of the problem, to get back to this sort of, where I differ from Alan Watts, is that as much as I want to celebrate and agree with about 99% of what Watts is saying, especially about finding that we are of the earth. We didn't come in it. We're something that's doing, and life is a kind of dance, and we need not try to accomplish anything. We're already more than we could accomplish. I mean, there is something really beautiful about the message of a an acceptance of being the change, and to not cling or to avoid the temptations of desire. I think there's so much that's right-minded about that. Unfortunately, the human capacity for self-deception seems to know no bounds, and I see more and more people who, even if they can understand that in some way, they seem not to recognize how life has a kind of gift character, and that gift character implicates a self-aware individual who is implicated with a kind of guilt. And now I would say the best way to try to see the guilt isn't directly. It's to go and to perform acts that are kind and that try to give back to the world, and where you really struggle to give back to the world and to others. My guess is that for many people, especially Westerners, it feels very good. Well, the reason it feels good is that there's an expiation that's going on. I mean, the expiation as a kind of meaning horizon is the evidence of the guilt that's there. I mean, that's why it feels good. Now, I really want to stress the theory of natural guilt that I've been trying to develop, that you can find so well represented here in Ernest Becker's Escape from Evil. It's not a finger shake from an individual wrongdoing. It has to do with an organism who is utterly dependent on a mysterious bounty of which it is a part, but it gets slowly released into its own autonomy. And from there, it's guilty of never being sure where those lines are. See, we're not just a fruit of this earth. We are, oddly, that one fruit which needs to shape itself. We need to give ourselves form and substance in order to shape our own fruit. And that's part of, I think, the awkwardness that the human feels. So those are some of my thoughts on, I guess, where I differ a little bit from Alan Watts. Okay, thanks. Alan Watts. Okay, thanks.